Okay. Welcome, Tanya and Beer, chapter 2. L'chaim. I know last class we ended up chapter 1. We were praying for the Heat. Thank God they won. Now we can learn. Now we need real prayers against Denver, so we're gonna learn.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, spoiler alert. So if anyone watches this class in the future, like, what is he talking about? Right? So we gotta try to keep it current.
Well,
okay.
He made history.
Yeah. So in chapter 1 we learned about, at least initially, very 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 briefly, we learned generally just the fact that there's a natural soul. Natural soul, actually, throughout Tanya, it's not going to be called a natural soul. Throughout Tanya, it's going to be called the animal soul. And the reason why it's called the animal soul is because just like an animal only strives to fulfill its desires, that's its existence, its being. An animal wants to feel good.
Here's what I found.
Fair enough.
Thank you. An animal wants to feel good. So too, the nefesh bahamis, the natural soul, the animal soul, we're going to call it, wants to feel good. And sometimes doing good feels good. Doesn't mean necessarily, scarfing down hamburgers, French fries. Sometimes you do something nice for a person, makes you feel good. But the fact that it makes you feel good, that's not godly. That's natural. Okay? Today we're going to move into a totally new chapter. It talks about the Jewish soul. Because one of the things we're talking about in the last class was Hashem desired that the Jewish people should have a positive impact in the world, should change the world. Now, in order to change the status quo, you can't just have regular stuff. You have to have something special. So before we get into chapter 2, let me introduce the concept by introducing something that's seemingly totally unrelated. The Torah begins with the book of Genesis, right? Where God created the world. One of the famous questions, and Rashi quotes this question, why did the Torah have to begin with creation? Don't we know there's a God? Don't we know there's a creator? Well, you believe in a creator because it says it in the Torah? No. You believe in the creator because there's a world. Obviously, there has to be a creator. So Rashi, very first Rashi, the great commentator, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, lived in the 1000s, 1100s, and born in France. And he says like this, and he says, because when the nations of the world will come and say, the Jewish people stole the land of Israel, so this is the answer, that God created the world and he can give the land of Israel to whoever he wishes. So for a certain amount of time, for 2,488 years, it belonged to the nations of the world. Now it belongs to the Jewish people. That's Rashi's answer. The Rebbe asks a question, which is a great question. He says, what kind of ridiculous argument is that? People fight over, nations fight over land all the time. Right? So this land was previously belonged to the indigenous population, then the Spaniards came, then the French came, the English came, the Americans came, the Mexicans, right? Land is constantly, like my grandfather comes from a town that depending on which 50, 100 years, is either Russian or Polish. It really depends. So that's okay. Why, when it comes to the Jews in Israel, they stole the land? What do you mean? We conquered it fair and square. There was a fight. We won. You lost. Go home. And why? So the Rebbe explains, no, there's something more. Because once the Jewish people conquered the land of Israel, or the land of Canaan, and made it the land of Israel, it's forever the Holy Land. Even Gentiles say you stole the land. It's no more subject to the natural laws. Because the Romans can conquer it, the Persians, the Greeks, it's still called the Holy Land. You went and you changed the status quo of the earth. Who gave you the right to do that? So that's why Torah has to come and say, God created the world, and created the world for purpose, and he put the Jewish people on earth, and he gave them the Torah to recognize that purpose, to change the status quo. How do we do that? So we can't just be like everyone else. If you expect us to change everyone else, or have an impact on everyone else, we can't be like everyone else. We have to have the power. What's this power? Nefesh Hashenis B'Yisrael, chapter 2. V'nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael, the second soul of the Jewish people, of a Jewish person, he chelik elokam mimal mamash, is a part of God above. Now this line chelik elokah mimal is not authored by the Alter Rebbe. It's actually a quote. It's a mixture of quotes from Rav Chaim Vital, who was this former student of the Arizal. It also appears in, I think, another Kabbalistic book. What the Alter Rebbe does add, is the word mamash. Mamash means is actual. It's not figurative. It's literal. That every Jew's walking around with a part of God inside of him. But again, God, I mean, you can't compare it to anything else. But just like, for example, fire. How many candles can you light for one candle? Infinity. But they all come from the same candle. So you might think, oh, chopping God in pieces. Obviously, it doesn't mean that. Now the Alter Rebbe is going to prove it from biblical text. Like it's written in the beginning of Genesis, on day 6, when God created man. It said he formed him from the dust of the earth, and then and he blew into his nostrils a soul of life. Now, just to digress for a second, what's the difference between the way human beings were created and animals were created? No, not one day. What's the difference? How they're created?
We were made
not when.
in God's image.
Okay, but that's not how. How? So this is a question that is discussed in the commentaries. That the animals were created, their bodies and life force together. When God said, "Let there be creepy crawlers," they came out alive. They came out of the ground alive. When God made man, I say man, I mean human beings. He first formed their body, and then afterwards, he blew into their nostrils a soul of life. Now this is why, I forgot which commentator discusses, how come animals don't have this economy of feeling empty or purpose in their life? Because their body and soul are fused together as one. They don't have a soul conscience that's saying, how much grass you're gonna eat? Fat pig, one pig talking to other pig, right? They don't have this issue. But human beings, because our souls and our bodies were brought together, fused together as two separate items. Therefore, there's this constant pull, tug of war, back and forth. So first, Hashem created the human body out of the dust of the earth, and then he blew into his nostrils a soul of life. And then the Alter Rebbe brings another proof. We actually say this in the morning prayers. Right? In the morning prayer, we have Modani, the blessing of washing our hands. Then we thank Hashem that our body works right, all the plumbing, Asher Yitzhar, right? That all the orifices and the pipes all work right. Because one of them closes when they should be open, and one of them opens when it should be closed, and then you're in the ER. And then after that, Ben did, right? So you can testify that that's the case.
Many times.
And then afterwards we speak. There's a whole paragraph over there about the neshama, Lakai, neshama shenasatabi, the neshama that you gave to me, tahirate, pure, atanafach. And we say the atanafachtabi, you blew it into me. Now, so we see over here the verb blow is significant because it's used multiple times. What's the difference between speaking and blowing? Speaking, the better rabbi you are, the more you can speak, right? Speaking, you can go, right? Sometimes you're sitting in there and it's like, how much can you say? Shut up already, right? Be quiet. Speaking, you can, the old joke, right? I think it's always appropriate for this. This rabbi was giving a speech, and he was going, and slowly, not respectful like this congregation. This would never happen here. But people started filing out, And the guy was going 1 hour, 2 hours. Finally, after 3 hours, one guy left. And the rabbi goes over to him and says, "Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I lost track of time. There was no clock on the wall." So the guy says, "There was no clock on the wall, but there was a calendar." Right? You can speak. Speaking is easy. I mean, you turn on, if you ever listen to sports radio, they speak 3 hours. About what?
Nothing.
right? And they're speaking and speaking and speaking. ESPN 24/7. What are you speaking about, right? The Super Bowl. I always marvel. The Super Bowl, 6-hour pregame. 2 weeks before, 6-hour pregame, and they're yenting. But when you blow a balloon. How much? After a while, it tires you out. Well, let's say you're amazing, but there's only certain amount a person can blow. Why? Because it's coming from a place a lot deeper inside of you. So everything in the Torah is significant. So if you look at the 6 days of creation, it says God said, "Let there be." God said. Vayomer Elokim. But when it comes to the human soul, it says Vayipach, and he blew. Oh, so that denotes it's coming from a different place. And we see, it says in the Zohar, I'm on page, in the old print, it's 48. Oh, that's for me, in the Saf. All right? He says, and it's written in Zohar, Zohar, Man de nafach, someone, he who blows, mitoiche nafach, it's coming from inside. Pirush, what does that mean from the inside? Mitoiche yusoi, upnime yuto, from his inwardness and his innermost being. It means, if you keep blowing, like you're gonna pass out because you're giving out your energy. So when you blow from inside hard, it's coming from a very deep place. For it's the inward and innermost vitality. It comes at about a man when he's blowing with force. So blowing tires a person. The first time I read this, blowing tires, I'm like, wow, yeah. Right? Yep. If you read the text here, right? Yeah, blowing tires. Like, no wonder it took so long to invent the wheel. So blowing, tires a person much more quickly than speaking, as is rarely observed. For it requires greater exertion of effort and vitality. Hence, the fact that the metaphor of blowing is used to describe Hashem's implanting of a Jewish soul in a body signifies that the soul originates from a much more inner place of godliness. Now, by the way, I just want to point out before we go on, you might ask, this verse is spoken about Adam Arishan. Who's the first Jew? Avram. So, how is this a proof? You want to tell me about the soul of a Jew? Bring me a question. Bring me a verse about about Avram. Yeah. Want to tell me about Adam? So what really started with Avram isn't the godly soul. It existed already before Avram. What started with Avram was that it was inherited from father to son, mother to daughter. That means before Avram, it was given to. So, for example, Adam had a godly soul. Cain didn't, Hevel did. Shes did. Then Enosh didn't, for example. Mr. Shalach did, Chanoich did, Aparsha didn't. God sort of picked and chose. It was up to him, so to speak. So Noach did, Cham didn't, Yafes didn't, Shem did, Aver did. But with the covenant that Hashem made with Avram, starting with him, and it's Avram, Sarah, Yitzchak, automatically. Anyone who Yitzchak has, ki bi Yitzchak yikar l'chazar. Because Yitzchak is going to be your seed. Anyone start after him is going to have a godly soul. So was Esav a Jew? Yes. Esav, the Gemara calls Esav Yisrael Mumar, an apostate Jew, but he was a Jew. So
having a godly soul like Adam doesn't necessarily mean he was Jewish?
No, because to be Jewish means that you're appointed by God to be. So maybe it's worthwhile to.
Because you said he had a godly soul, right?
So I once read that what happened with Avram different than what happened with Adam. So Hashem created Adam. Adam wasn't naive and a kid. Adam was created an adult. I think it says he was created like at 20 years. He's created an adult. And Adam was very knowledgeable in the ways of, we gotta keep an eye on the time, right? Adam was very knowledgeable in the ways of God. So it's not like Adam didn't know who God was. God spoke to him, right? The bigger question is, how could Adam eat from the tree if God spoke to you, right? That should have an impact. It's not like Adam didn't know. He read it in the book. God spoke to him. So he knew who God was.
Right? He experienced seeing. He saw.
He saw God.
Maybe heard.
He definitely heard.
Heard.
God spoke to him.
Oh.
In fact, Adam was the one who created Rosh Hashanah. You familiar with this medrash? I know we're getting off subject, but it's okay.
Adam created. Yeah, he was born on Rosh Hashanah.
Not only that, it says that Adam was created like a giant, huge, right? And he walked on 2 feet. And the animals, and all animals were afraid of him. And Adam sort of said, no. I'm not the king. I'm not God. Let us all, Adam proclaimed, let us all accept God as king. Rosh Hashanah is about accepting God as king. Who was the first one to accept God as king? Adam. Adam invented the holiday of Rosh Hashanah. I mean, the idea that you accept God as king.
Convenient that he made it on his birthday.
Right. Right, because everyone gathered for a party for Rosh Hashanah. Yeah, my birthday. Right?
It's my guy, guys. No.
Right.
Bring
What?
presents.
Oh, Eve, you brought a cake for me?
Right.
Oh,
But I was gonna say a joke, but it's not tied into any Jewish, which makes it ironic that we're dipping apples in honey. Although the tree wasn't an apple tree. Do you know? There's no Jewish source for it being an apple tree, by the way. That's a purely Christian idea. It's either fig, etrog, wheat, grape, but not apple. Anyway, Adam was created with knowledge that God exists, and the knowledge that God cares, and God. In fact, when Adam messed up, he thought, "That's it. I screwed up. Right? Nothing I can do. God gave me one job." And so when Cain kills Abel. By the way, if I'm using too many Hebraic, Judaic, Yiddish terms, you have to interrupt me and ask, because. So when Cain kills Hevel, so later, Adam bumps into Cain and says, "What are you doing here?" So, "What do you mean what am I doing here?" He says, "If I was kicked out of the Garden of Eden for eating a fruit, you killed the guy. God didn't kill you?" "Oh no, I did the shuvah. I repented." Adam repented. "What's that?" "I said, I'm sorry. I said, I screwed up." "You can do that?" Adam said, "If I would have known." Right? So it's like Adam didn't know. Adam knew, and you have to. It's reasonable to assume. I mean, Cain and Hevel both brought sacrifices to God, so they both knew about God, right? So what went wrong? We'll get to that later. But to be a Jew doesn't mean that you know about God. To be a Jew means you teach others about it. That's the difference between Adam, Noach. So Chanoich is the one who died early, right? Chanoich, right?
Who died what?
Who died early? It says that God took him, right? Chanoich,
Yes,
right? You're into
yes,
this garbage,
Enoch.
right?
Enoch.
Chanoich, yeah. Chanoich died early, right? Because it says Chanoich ki enenu, he wasn't there. Ki lakach oto Elokim, God took him, right? Why? Because he was a very righteous person, and God didn't want him to become contaminated by society, so he took him.
Oh
Right?
wait, no, that's not Chanoch.
No,
That's
what's Chanoich? No?
yes.
Chanoich.
Yeah, Enoch. Yeah, turned it into.
Whatever. What do you care? We turned it. I don't want to get. I
Yes.
was afraid to bring it up. I knew you'd go down.
No. Sorry.
Okay. The point is, but that's not a Jew. A Jew is not a person. We talked about this in the class before. A Jew is not a person whose job is to maintain religiosity despite the world going to hell around him. That's not a Jew. A Jew's job is to impact the world around him. So, for example, Noach's not the first Jew. God comes to Noach, and we're talking. Some of the subject I'm saying now is going to be repeated. God comes to Noach and says, "I'm going to destroy the world." What does Noach tell God? "All right, do whatever you got to do." That's not Jewish. Jewish is that God comes to Avram and says, "I'm going to destroy Sodom," and Avram said, "Hell no, you're not." And how can you? Right, a God of justice is not going to do justice. He can't find 10 guys, and these are guys that deserved it and everything else. And Avram said, "Hey, more land for me. Get rid of the people," right? So that's Jewish. So to have every Jew has a godly soul, but to be a Jew means yet you're interested in an ism. Jews have always been into isms to somehow change the world: communism, socialism, capitalism, something to positively impact the world. So Adam had a godly soul. The reason why he wasn't Jewish was because he didn't do much with it. Anyway, so getting back. So just like the godly soul is blown into Adam. which we said comes from a very deep place, kach al derech mashal, so too, allegorically speaking, neshamis Yisrael, the souls of the Jewish people, alu b'machshava, they rose in divine thought. So, keeping in mind that the rest of creation was said with speech, and speech is a very external. In fact, we're actually going to speak about this in chapter 21 and 22. The very purpose of speech is external. So, if you speak to yourself and say, hey, that's not so regular. Why? Because usually speech means you're expressing yourself to someone else. Thought means you're expressing yourself to yourself. Thought is personal, right? If you're disturbing my thoughts, you're bothering me. I have to think, right? So the rest of the world comes from God's speech. It's a lower aspect of godliness. The Jewish souls come from God's thought, and Hashem's thought is a very personal, very deep part. Kidiksiv. Now, how do you know? Now the Alter Rebbe is going to get a little bit scientific, because it says when Moshe comes to Pare the first time, and he tells Pare, let me tell you something, you are picking on, in the name of God, he says, you're picking on my firstborn. I'm warning you now, I'm going to pick on your firstborn. Pare was warned about the death of the firstborn in the beginning. It wasn't a surprise. He was told that in the beginning. That was the culmination, but he was told. So he says, this is part of the prophecy that Moshe tells Paro, B'ni b'chori Yisrael. Israel, the Jewish people, are my firstborn. And then in the book of Deuteronomy, Moshe tells the Jewish people, Banim atem l'Hashem lekechem, you are children of God. Now, the Alter Rebbe is now going to talk about the scientific part of it, of the connection between father and son, to express the connection the Jewish people have to God. Now, you might ask, if you're looking for a connection, you should bring the mother, right? But the mother is an obvious connection. That we said the kid right away runs to the mother. The reason why we have to bring the father is because we don't see the connection. So if we can see the connection between the child and the father, that in our minds will help us make the connection between Jew and God. Any questions, by the way, or because I'm going to keep yenting until someone interrupts me. Or the lights turn off. Right? This ain't Motel 6. We're not keeping the light out for.
Is this just an acknowledgement of the difference that was first noticed in Abraham, and that's what made him Jewish, or
what made him Jewish was God appointing him.
God put that Jewish soul in him, and you can notice it because he was the first one that actually stood up in defense of mankind.
So, Avram had a Jewish soul.
Yeah, right.
The covenant was that every child after him.
That was the first time that God had done that?
No, Adam had a Jewish soul also. Had a godly soul, not a Jewish, a godly soul.
Because there's the two souls. There's the second soul that is the one that we're talking about now, right?
So, really, there's three different souls spoken about.
Okay.
There's the animal soul. There's the intellectual soul. The animal soul means you're a mammal, living, breathing. You want to survive. Then there's your intellectual soul, which is your human soul. That's the same as Jews and Gentiles. That's our Homo sapiens part of it.
Ever since Adam.
Every
single person.
Every single person has an animal soul and a intellectual soul. Jewish people have a third soul. Now, the Alter Rebbe doesn't really speak about the intellectual soul. He usually refers to the animal soul and the godly soul.
The godly soul, the first time that was inserted was in Abraham?
No, Adam had a godly soul.
And from Adam to Abraham, none of them had it?
No. So Shais,
You named every
Adam,
one
not every. I skipped Adam, Hevel, Shais.
Some he didn't breathe it into?
No. It wasn't given later. No, the only one that was breathed into was Adam.
The heavenly soul, the godly soul was breathed into Adam.
Yeah.
Abraham was breathed
Maybe
into him?
the question, it was given to him. The question, when was he given? So the question you're asking is, when did Avram get his godly soul?
I'm trying to.
Was he born with it? Was he born with it, or was it bequeathed to him at a later point?
It's not. He's not the first one to have it. I understand now.
No.
Since Adam, it's been available.
Right.
Some of them did have it.
So maybe I'm wrong. I had to do research. Maybe to the people before Avram, was available to you based on service. If you
Irrelevant. From Adam, it was transmitted. Like you can. It's automatic.
No, it wasn't. Just the opposite. Before, from Adam to Avram, it was given by God based on service and what he decided. After Avram, it was automatic. Avram and Sarah got it based on service. Yitzchak got it automatic. Yitzchak was the first automatic Jew, regardless of service. Now, Yitzchak happened to be a tzaddik.
Yeah, I got you. That's why Edom is also considered an
Asaph. Asaph.
Yeah.
Not Edom. Asaph, yeah. The problem is, if you look at his family tree in Parshas Vayishlach, it goes
right.
It goes that way. They kind of messed things up, right? Or like Jeff Foxworthy says, if your family tree don't have any forks in it, you might be a redneck.
They are made of clay and iron. There's a prophet the prophecy that Daniel had, like the 4 levels of like the Babylon. Persia,
Yeah,
like
right.
Greek,
Referring to, right?
and the Romans.
Okay, so now the Alter Rebbe is going to explain. A child now is connected to his father. Why? Because he says. Hold on, let me see. Am I getting? Okay, so he says that a son comes. He's going to say it now and expand it later on, chapter 2. He says, "Pirush kamosha ben nimshach u'mechav," just like the child is derived from the father's brain, because yes, biologically, a child is made up of sperm and egg, but the function of a person's entire body comes from the brain. So therefore, the fluid that used to make up the child comes from the father's brain. Kach kav yachal, the same thing is, so to speak, anthropomorphism. That word, by the way, is very important here, anthropomorphism, because many times we attribute different things to God and everything else, but they're only words that we can become comfortable with. So, for example, in Genesis, and God said, I mean, it's not the same speaking as we are. And God took us out of Egypt with a strong hand. These are anthropomorphism, is when you attribute human or animalistic attributes to something that's really not physical. Okay, so it says same thing is the shamas kol ish Yisrael nimshecha. All the shamas of every Jew nimshecha is drawn, is derived b'machshavto u'mechachmot yisparach, from God's thought and wisdom. And you might say, what's the big deal? So now the Alter Rebbe is going to go on and quote Kabbalah, and he's also going to quote the Rambam. He says, "Ti'iyu chachim." This is a quote from Kabbalah. "Ti'iyu chachim." He is wise, but not the wise that we possess. Elohu v'chachmas echad. So, in today's time, this example is very, very well understood, because when this was written, they didn't have computers. So in olden times, this is more abstract, but in our times, this is very well understood. You buy a computer. So in your computer, you have a hard drive, which stores information. Then you have your RAM, which is the processes, how fast can your computer take in information. Then you have the information. So there are really 3 things. Same thing is, so you have some people with incredible memory. They can remember, you teach them once and all, but it takes some time to learn. So you have their brain that stores information. You have their seichel, their intellect. You know, some people have good brain, good seichel. Then you have the subject matter, right? So that's because we are composite beings. Everyone in the world, everything in the world are composite beings. Everything. The God is one, so His intellect is also one. So there's no. If you see the Rambam, he quotes the Rambam in the bottom of 49. So there's a knower, the known, and the knowledge. Hashem is all 3 together. So because it's one with Him. So if you say, when it comes to, let me tell you a wild story. Listen to this. Is a crazy story. One of my favorite stories. Listen to this. Talking about how knowledge, because knowledge is usually one with you. Once you know it, you know it. If you're supposed to review it. So the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement, right? It's very, very, very holy mystical, angelic person. One time he was walking outside on the road, and he heard a shepherd playing a tune, and he understood through his spiritual understanding that this tune would be very well serviced and in the service of God. He wanted to utilize it. So he goes over to the shepherd. He says, I want to pay you for the song. I want you to teach me the song. And it's going to be my song, not your song. You can't use it anymore. The shepherd is a guy, a Gentile. He thought, this is old Jew's an idiot. I'll teach him the song. I'll make my money and then, no, I won't use it anymore. Yeah, whatever. So the Alter Rebbe was actually quite musical. He composed 14 tunes by himself. And,
He was like a Jewish Suge Knight.
Dr. Dre.
Okay.
Jewish what?
Suge Knight, like a Puff Daddy.
Isn't that-
Suge Knight?
Suge Knight, he was like a record producer.
Oh, sorry. Okay. If you would have said Bach or something.
He was
Who
gonna
is
say.
Bach's manager?
Exactly. He was a Jew.
He was gonna say Kanye West, but that's not appropriate.
Not allowed.
Well, exactly. He's not. I had to throw out all my Kanye West records. Yeah. Is he the one that changed his name or something? No, that wasn't it.
He's the one that.
Didn't he change his name to Ye, Way?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
We all do it.
Yeah. Anyway, taxes. Says,
Best explanation.
it's not me. It's not me. Send it to the other guy, right? Right.
He is Jewish.
Right. He's like a Jewish accountant. Right.
I'm sorry.
So anyway, so the Alter Rebbe goes. He pays the shepherd, and the shepherd teaches him once, twice, 3 times, whatever it is. Alter Rebbe pays him. Thank you very much. He walks away. The shepherd thinks, idiot. Picks up his flute to play the song. He forgot it. Couldn't play it. Now, why is that story a story? Because usually when you know something, it's a part of you. I can't separate it. Because the part of you that's the most one with you is your knowledge. So when you say that a neshama comes from Hashem's knowledge, that's not, child's play. That means something. The soul is one with God. And he said, Rambam, and this is what the Rambam says, that Hashem is the Mada, the Yedeya, and Yidu. Hashem is the knower, the known, and the knowledge. And then the Alter Rebbe, and it continues. I'm on page 50. And the knower, the known, and the knowledge. And the Alter Rebbe says the problem is we're speaking about something. For example, we say many times the word forever. Do we really understand the word forever?
No.
The word infinity? Many times, a regular schmo Joes will sit on the jury, like you might get Marlboro against, Joe Smith. Pay him $6 billion. Do we understand that number? We don't understand that number. I mean, you hear about it, jobs, whatever. You would like to, 1 trillion. We don't understand that number. So we're talking about God as knower, the known, He was, He is. We say these words, but we don't truly understand it. And it is not within. This is quoting the Maimonides. In the beginning of Maimonides, when he talks about the existence of God and all these different things, the Maimonides gives the outline, but he says ultimately it's always going to be lacking because a person can't truly understand it. Kidiksiv. And he quotes Job, and he says, a philosopher is going to find God. You're going to find God by searching. You're never going to get to the right answer. Uksiv, like Hashem tells Yeshayahu, and this actually is a prophecy we read on the fast day. And the fast day is a time, except for Yom Kippur, but the other fast days are for negative events. And we don't understand why negative things happen. So Hashem tells Yeshayahu, Kiloi machshavotay machshavotechem. My thought processes and your thought process are not the same. If you can't understand it, that's a you problem. Doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. I have a plan. Like God told Job, you live 70, 80, 90 years, and you can't understand it because you're looking at a small sample size. I'm talking about a plan for thousands of years. So now it doesn't make sense, but soon it will. So these are all multiple proofs that God's knowledge is sublime and above and something we can't even begin to fathom to understand. So when we say a Jewish soul is one with Hashem's knowledge, that means it's coming from a very deep place. Now we'll end off tonight with, to answer a question. Okay, we'll do the note. Next week we're gonna get it. We'll pick it up. Alter Rebbe because Alter Rebbe is very honest, and he quotes the Maimonides. But when Maimonides says that God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known, some other people have problems with that. And Maimonides, everyone accepts Maimonides. Maimonides said the Rambam. Is it okay if I say that the Rambam? Yeah. The Rambam said some very strong things. Some things that were the rabbis shook their head, like, really? So when he says over here, he says the God's the knower, the known, and the knowledge. The Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Yehuda Lowy, says, what are you talking about? What we call God Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Hakadosh Baruch Hu is blessed be He. Kadosh means separate. Kadosh means it's sanctified. We can't understand it, right? It's beyond description. It says, if that's what God is, why don't we call Him the knower? Blessed be He. There's a reason why we call Him HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In fact, he says, the Maharal writes, one of the 13 principles that you yourself, Maimonides, write, is that God has no description. But you just gave Him a description. Right? So the Alter Rebbe answers that question. So he says, this is the Haggadah, the note on page 51. Again, in your page. It says, V'hoido lechachmei Kabbalah, and the Kabbalists agreed with the Rambam. That what his description was true. What do you mean? How can it be true? So it says, Sevensich. It depends on which level of God or godliness you're talking about. He says, "V'zekam l'fi Kabbalah Rizal yisifta bilsal." Also, according to the Kabbalah of the Rizal, a statement stands. Why? Because, I mean, again, I don't want to get into. If we want, we can next week we can explain it more at length. But very quickly, maybe next week, well, it's worth it to get into this more at length because we're going to cover this at a different time. Very quickly, before God created the world, it was God and godliness. Right? It says, who was Shmo Levado? It was Him and his name. His name is godliness, expression of Him. In order for God to have created the world, He had to hide Himself, so to speak. It's called Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum literally means contraction. We're going to get into this more, this is not something to run into. Tzimtzum literally means contraction, where you block, you hide the light that's there. In order, so if there's too much light, right? So you put curtains, right? So before, so sometimes when there's too much light, you can't make it out, right? You have to. So before the tzimtzum, before the contraction, you're right. There is no description, and it's a God that we don't understand. But after the tzimtzum, then godliness begins to take shape and form, as we're going to learn in chapter 3. There's chachma, there's bina, there's das, there's all these different sfirot, and also God of compassion, God of mercy. God isn't compassion, there's God. So when you say God of mercy, it's how we're experiencing Him. So it's before the tzimtzum, after the tzimtzum, before the contraction, after the contraction. Next week we'll get back into it. There's a difference between concealment and contraction. Very quickly. Concealment is when you water down the light. So if you have a window, okay? You put a curtain, that's concealment. The quality of light is lessened. Contraction is you put a board over the window, except for a small hole. So the light that's coming in, the quality is the same, but you've limited it. So many times we're going to learn in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe is using interchangeable terms. They're not. Each term, like we learned in the 2 classes ago, Klippa and Sitra Achra, Helem and Tzimtzum, concealment and contraction, they're not the same. Now, in order for God to create the world, both were necessary. Tzimtzum, contraction, and Helem, concealment. But only after all that's done, the process this is going to be referenced many times in Tanya, only after that can the concept of creation even begin to take place. So in the note, he says that after the tzimtzum, this is applied without what Rambam said, this is applied that Ur and Save the infinite light goes through numerous contractions, Bekelim the Chabad in the vessels in the Sfirot of Chabad, Chachma Miradas, the Atzilus, and again we're gonna explain that a little bit more later. What the world of Atzilus, Bria, we'll spend time explaining that properly. But it's about to finish Lamaila Atzilus, but higher than Atzilus, higher than Tzimtzum, higher than contraction. But that's just godliness without definition. Like as explained elsewhere, we're actually learning this section of Tanya now in the daily Tanya. That the infinite blessed Ein Sof, the infinite light is infinitely exalted over and transcends the level of Chabad. That means, to end off on this point, so you're alive, right? So then you take a moment and you appreciate that you're alive. Who gives you life? God. But then you think a little bit more. You say, well, God's not defined by giving me life. He's greater than that, right? God gives the whole world life, but doesn't really define him, right? God's energy is really greater than the world. And then, the more you think about it a little more, the world doesn't matter, zero. There's nothing in our world that can relate to. That all these things we're throwing out over here, they're just lower levels of experience. So, as Chassidus normally does, the Maharal and the Rambam, Rabbi Yehuda Loi and the Rambam, they're not arguing. They're talking about two different levels. One's not right, one's not wrong. They're both right. Questions, answers, comments? All right, guys. Good going.
Big change from the first episode, from the first chapter.
Yeah, very big.
Very big difference. Very big change.